Debating death and memory, past and present. It's an Archaeodeath debate.
Not necessarily the most exciting of topics at first glance, but how we publish academic work is of key importance for quality and rigour in the scholarly community. And many people outside academia, and actually quite a few people inside academia, have really bizarre, shall we say, archaic or left field ideas about what peer review and the academic publication process is all about. So let me use this video to explain something of the process of academic publishing and peer review specifically. Now, my background in this is, of course, as an academic of over 20 years standing, publishing in a range of different venues, different journals, different books. I've been through peer review many times, where, in other words, other academics, peers, they may be senior scholars, they may be junior scholars, they may be middle career scholars, they may not even be in universities, but they may be experts in their field. In any case, are asked to evaluate and recommend to an editor the quality of my work. And also, as an editor of books, as an editor of special issue journals and of journals myself, the Archaeological Journal for the Royal Archaeological Institute and now the Offers Dyke Journal, I've had to go through this process of receiving recommendations based on peers of pieces of work submitted for publication in my work, in my publications. So we're all subjected to this, we're all victims of peer review, and we're all reliant on each other to evaluate each other's work. First things first, a lot of this work is done for free, and therefore it is a collective responsibility that we work for each other to ensure the quality of work coming out. We can use it and claim it for credit in terms of our standing in the community, that people ask for our evaluations, and we can use it as an indication therefore of our relative esteem or prestige, but really it's not paid work. Now, there's a whole debate about whether it should be paid work, and that's a separate topic, but at the moment most peer review work is done without being paid for it, and therefore it's done as a kind of favour, but a favour we all take on the responsibility of, to ensure quality is maintained within the academic community. And this matters to us, it matters to us now, and it will matter to us as we advance our careers and we rely on each other, and we also see the quality of work maintained. That's the ideal anyway. So academic peer review matters, it's not paid, but it's an important part of what we're all doing for each other, knowing that we'll benefit, and we will also be able to pass on our experience and knowledge as part of the review of other people's work. Now, one of the common topics that gets a lot of social media academic chatter whining about is that peer review is a kind of gatekeeping. And I must admit that I don't like receiving critical peer review, and I have been rejected from journals by the editor or by referees recommending to the editor, and it never feels nice. And even when I have an opportunity to respond and revise my work, as often happens, in response to peer review comments, you know, the immediate sense of getting those critical comments on work you spent, months, maybe even years working on, is a punch in the gut, and sometimes worse, and I won't deny that. But equally, I must say that the number of times I've felt maltreated by the peer review process, which is often anonymous, they don't know who I am, or if they do know who I am, I certainly don't know who they are. The number of times I felt maligned, or perhaps I've received snide comments or dismissive comments in the peer review that was unnecessary or I felt was unfair, it pales into insignificance compared with the number of times I've been sort of saved from making errors, because peer reviewers are part of the process of fact-checking, but also I've been saved in terms of poor lines of argumentation and recommendations for further work I should read, indications of where I could enhance or develop the argument, have been invaluable in multiple cases. And often editors will help, but editors vary in the ability that they have to wade in, and often it's the peer reviewers that the editors and the authors rely on to help us with a particular editorial process. So, in other words, peer review is sometimes seen as gatekeeping by academics, usually by academics who have maybe quite established in the field but don't understand the process of rigour. They feel they've got a right to be published and everyone else is getting in their way. they're usually the same whiny little sods that say that their Twitter feeds are deserving of being called publications of academic merit. Now, these individuals will and stay on the fringe of academic discourse because their Twitter feeds tend to be trash and their actual academic work tends to be poor quality, which is why again and again they receive rejections from journals, not because they don't like the look of their face or they don't like their age or gender, but mostly because there are serious intellectual problems with their theory, their method, or their data sets, or all three. Now, there are biases in peer review. There is favouring of male and white and senior scholars, but peer review isn't necessarily the problem there. In fact, getting outside of peer review, and many other strategies and models have been suggested, including an open peer review, which I have experienced, and I can't say I was impressed by, or indeed some other kind of sort of collegiate process. There are alternatives to it, but for the moment, I think it serves to maintain a scale, a degree of rigour and fact-checking and correction and allowing the scholars to develop their work. Not everyone will agree with me with that take, and indeed in the world of Twitter I imagine this would be a very unfashionable and old-fashioned take, but I will tell you that in having edited literally thousands of other people's work and evaluated thousands as an editor or as a peer reviewer, or relying on peer reviewers as an editor or being a peer reviewer myself, I would say that I've always tried to be constructive, help an author get published and give them an avenue, a route to improve their work, even if I see major flaws in what they're writing. On the other side of it, I would say that peer review is never without fault, and I encounter regularly in supposedly prestigious journals articles that have got through peer review, and yet I would say, how on earth did that happen, given the flaws in the presentation of data or the method or indeed the ideas that underpin the argument. Okay, I've come to a new location to continue my discussion of editing and peer review. Now, as an editor, you try to select multiple peer reviewers. You don't want to rely on one expert voice to evaluate any submission of a manuscript. That is simply the worst kind of bias. And you want to try and avoid other kinds of biases. Like, you don't want to just pick people who have been working in a very niche field. You want their expertise, but you want to balance that up with someone who has a broader perspective, maybe from a different region but the same period, maybe from a different discipline but the same period, maybe from a different slightly different chronological focus or different technical or methodological focus. And you may want someone who's an expert in the theoretical debate, so you may balance that up with a second peer reviewer who is a more methodological expert, or someone who has field experience. In other words, you want to balance the different views you get as an editor. Now, the peer reviewers, they're not paid, as I said, and that is perhaps an issue, and they tend to be not really their role is not really to be responsible for the work. They're supposed to be independent, but by asking them for a review, they're making a recommendation to the editor. They're not speaking directly to the author, and that is a strength of the process. So you actually get to make the decision as an editor. The referees are there, or the reviewers are there to make recommendations to the editor. Now, you often share the reports of the referees with the author so they can react to them and respond to them. You may want to edit them if they are a bit inflammatory or a bit sort of rhetorical, or perhaps just a bit over the top. But generally, you share the referees' comments with the author, allow them time to revise their manuscript if they can, or to go elsewhere if they feel they can't respond to those results. And so it's a process of dialogue between the editor, the referees, and the author, in which the editor is sort of sitting in the middle. Now, as an editor, I've often been in the situation where you get more than one referee sets of comments, two, three sometimes. Sometimes you ask more than you need and they all come back with evaluations, and I've had 4. And sometimes they're incredibly critical. And the editor has to make a judgment on how to handle that. Sometimes it's, I'm sorry, this piece has too many problems, I'm going to decline it. Sometimes you make a recommendation of major revisions. In other words, that there are some significant argumentation, content issues, presentation issues. There's still a lot for the author to do, and you send away the author with the major revisions and the indication that you'll be interested in seeing a revised version, but not committing to publication. Or you might decide that there are quite a few changes and critical revisions, but they can be encapsulated within minor sets of work. They're easily, relatively quick and easy to do. And you give an indication to the author that their work is publishable. And here are some of the revisions. And sometimes, very rarely, the pieces you go, yeah, there's only a few tweaks, a few typos, copy editing, a few fact checking, but generally this is ready for publication. But that actually tends to be quite rare. And for me, that shows that the process generally works. Yes, there are problems. Yes, there are nightmare stories we all have of referees that have taken umbrage at our existence. But on the whole, the process is there to check against unsupported, fantastical, fringe and imaginary arguments. But it's not. I'm not saying it's perfect. And if people are fabricating data, if they're sort of contriving arguments, peer reviewers don't always spot it. There's assumption that the author is not lying or faking material, and so that does mean that sometimes things do very, very rarely get through to publication that are actually not based on rigorous field work or rigorous lab-based analysis, or are almost border or intersect with pseudo-archaeology. They are sort of fake news, if you like. So it's not a perfect system, and there are many biases, as I said, and many qualifications, and senior scholars who have perhaps a more established formula of knowing what gets published, maybe perhaps not revolutionary work is easily published, but perhaps more radical or different work comes up against a barrier. So yeah, there is gatekeeping in the sense that there are checks and measures on ideas, but it's not stopping anything getting published anywhere. And of course, authors can take those views, take them on board, and withdraw their paper from the process and submit it elsewhere. No one's ever obliging the author to stay with a process until they've actually signed a contract after their paper has been accepted through a peer review process. So authors actually have a lot of opportunities and a lot of power and freedom. If an editor says these are the revisions I need to do, you can always go, bye-bye, I'm going elsewhere. And that does happen sometimes. So peer review is a complex process, and I've only outlined a few of the basics of it. And as you can see, I've had a lot of experience of it, and I stand by it, although I'm acutely aware of many of the criticisms behind why people feel frustrated with it. And I've certainly experienced in my time situations where I feel I've been unfairly treated, that I feel that the referees were just didn't like the idea because it challenged existing views. I've also been in a position where I've been saved, as I said, from making a fool of myself by having some checks and balances on what I've done, some measures of revision. I've also been in a position, I must say, where it's come to conflict, where as an editor I felt in dispute with the referees, and I've supported the paper, and referees have objected, but it's not their position to object, it's my decision as an editor. I've also been in a position as an author and as a referee where I've raised objections to papers. So as a referee, for example, I've raised objections where a paper I've suggested needs significant revisions has gone through to publication with none of those points raised or addressed at all. And I've also been an author where I felt, I don't feel I've been treated well. But equally, I would say there's been some really great experiences I've had, and some really supportive experiences. I can't judge the quality of my own work, but I can tell you of some good experiences, and I think I want to be positive about this and tell you about some of the experiences I've had over my career. And early on, I had some great experience with editors who were sympathetic. They may not have actually published my work in the end, but they were very supportive. And one of the first ones of these was the editor at the time of Anglo-Saxon Studies in Archaeology and History, who gave a lot of time to one of my first papers. I ended up publishing it elsewhere, but that positive dialogue was something that stayed with me right to this day. And I'm very much valued as a postgraduate student at the University of Reading, getting that interest in my work. As I said, I didn't publish there at that point, but that was really great. Other experiences I've had that have been amazingly positive, as much because of the editor and the peer reviewers as much as the copy editors, include the journal Early Medieval Europe, the Journal of Material Culture, which is more of an anthropology or interdisciplinary journal. Fantastic, rigorous peer review process I experienced there. European Journal of Archaeology, not only for the editorial and peer review, but also for the copy editing. I have an expert copy editor who's an archaeologist by training, who's able to help with the clarification of some of my arguments. Those are just 3 examples of working with top journals and getting a really rigorous process. Having said that, I've worked with some top journals, if I do that properly, top journals, and it's been a joke. There's been no real critical evaluation of my work, and if I'd allowed it to happen without any self-reflection, I could have published things that had very little critical evaluation. And I've been in some edited books that have come out in relatively humble publishing houses that I've had a really rigorous evaluation of my text and really help and support in getting it ready for publication. So we all have different views on this. It's a controversial topic, and there's a lot of complaining and a lot of genuine concerns, but also some whining about why doesn't the world like me that happen, especially when you're a junior scholar and by people who perhaps have an ego issue more than they are willing to admit. And the same goes for senior scholars. Some senior scholars can be very uppity when they don't get the way they want it to go through peer review. But it's a process we have, and I think it has value still. We have to keep working at it. And we, as a community of scholars, we have to work with each other to support it, or else all manner of crazy stuff will end up in print. And that's good for nobody and makes us all look bad and doesn't help the future of the discipline. So it's not a perfect system, it's got many biases in it, and I've only outlined a few, but I would say it still remains the best we have. Now, a lot of people just don't understand peer review. They think it is just a gatekeeping exercise. And so I thought this little video to introduce some of the key concepts would at least give you a sense of why it's so important. So imagine we are serious scholars that want peers to approve of our work, not necessarily agree with our work, but to see it as of an appropriate standard and quality. Then we must subject ourselves to a process, and this is the best we have at the moment.
For relaxing times, make it Archaeodeath time.